Welcome to a week on political socialization. We're going to talk not only about socialization but about a whole host of other things in this micro lecture and the other two that are here. So let's just jump right in and get started. And what we really want to look at here is how do we become conservative and liberal? What influences our belief system? Individuals in belief systems, we call this political socialization, this definition here, the process by which we learn our political orientations and allegiances. So this is really important. We want to take a look at this and see what are all the different things that help us learn to be who we are and what we believe. Our earliest influences, as your book describes in Shalom, are family, school, elementary school in particular. Take a look at your own family. Those are the very earliest people that influence you. So those of you who grew up in a family that, for example, was very political, and you talked politics an awful lot at the dinner table at night, you're probably going to have more of an interest in politics today than other people would who grew up in a home that didn't have much political discourse. Elementary school is another one too. This is where we go and learn the values that reflect American ideals. We say the Pledge of Allegiance, we learn about historic events, we're taught to respect authority, we're not taught to question authority at all. We're basically sort of indoctrinated into the cultural system in which we live. Every country has to do this in order to transfer knowledge from one generation to the next regarding the values that they hold dear as a nation. As we continue with education, another influence is high school. When we go to high school, we're taught to analyze a bit more, take a look at our political system, question it a little bit, but not as much as later. For those who go on to college, they're going to learn to criticize and analyze the world in ways you don't learn in high school. They're going to question authority, be exposed to different ideas and those types of things. And what we're going to see later is that higher education really influences our belief structure in a lot of ways. Other influences that we have are religion, race, region of the country you grow up in, your income level. All of these things are going to affect how we see the world. So for example, if you grow up in a particular religion, such as Jewish people, for example, look at the world differently from evangelical Protestants. Both view the world differently from Catholics to a very certain degree. Certainly you can understand how race is going to affect a person's outlook. Race combined with socioeconomic class that you grew up in is going to determine your outlook even more. Region of the country that you grew up in, someone who grows up in a small rural community in the Midwest or the South is probably going to have very different political beliefs than someone who grows up, say, in Seattle or San Francisco. And income, of course, goes without saying. This is really going to impact how we look at the political world. Those who grew up in poverty are going to see the world very differently from those who grew up in wealthier situations. So what does all this mean? Well, I want to show you my famous head. This head has served me well for 20 years of teaching. Basically, our socialization is forever going to shape how we view the world and process information. So take a look down here on the left side. These are the things, some of the things, there are more, that comprise our socialization. And what that does, this is my head here. What that socialization does is create what we might call a filter in our brain. This filter sets itself up, and we have certain ideas about certain issues, and we take information that we get and we process it through this filter. So we'll take information we receive and we'll tend to agree or disagree with its basic precepts and arguments based on this filter in our head. So we process information in, and out of our mouth comes our opinions. So what this basically means is no one is objective. We're all taking our life experiences and what those make us in terms of our belief system, taking information, processing it through that filter in our brain, filtering out ideas and thoughts that are uncomfortable, that don't agree with our predisposed notions, and then out of that comes our opinions. Other things that your book talks about that influence us a lot, and you need to take a look in Shalom around 218, 220, those particular pages, 219. On 220, Shalom talks about schools, You've got things like holidays. This is sort of a government structured education in a lot of ways. Holidays, exhibitions, monuments, flags, naming of public facilities. All these things are discussed on page 220 of Shalom, and on 219 of Shalom, 220, and those kinds of things. 222, 223. So be sure that you follow all that stuff and take a look at it. When we take a look at and also at the bottom of page 219 in Shalom is a nice little flow chart, figure 9.2. Be sure you look at that. The naming of public facilities, as they talk about in Shalom, influences the way we view the world in an awful lot of ways. What we choose to commemorate has a lot to do with our education. So in this way, our ideology has a real influence on our government has a real influence on our ideology. If we have a Martin Luther King Jr. holiday that says something about what our government emphasizes, monuments and exhibitions, for example, commemoration of the 50th anniversary of dropping the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there was great controversy surrounding that over whether to discuss the killing of 200,000 civilians or to claim that it ended the war and saved thousands of lives. So be sure you look at all that kind of stuff. Shalom points out at the bottom of 219 under education where he says, the commissioner, in determining that particular memorial, preferred to emphasize what he considered one of the outstanding things about the Civil War, which is, quote, the story of the devotion and loyalty of Southern Negroes to the Old South. So be sure you take a look at all that stuff. It's pretty important. We move on to schools, and in this particular chapter, Shalom spends an awful lot of time talking about higher education, schools, textbooks, and these kinds of things. How do textbooks portray our society? Textbooks are very important. This is what students are used to be educated with. So, for example, slavery, slaves were depicted as happy on page 222. Shalom talks about that. For example, a leading 1930 text that sold well nationwide stated that, quote, the majority of slaves were apparently happy. There was much to be said for slavery as a transitional status between barbarism and civilization, end quote. So you've got to look at those things that he gives you as an example. Textbooks in 1961, the Texas State Legislature passed a resolution declaring that American history textbooks should emphasize, quote, our glowing and throbbing history of hearts and souls inspired by wonderful American principles and traditions. That's at the bottom of page 222. So be sure you take a look at all that. Another thing that is discussed in Shalom an awful lot is political correctness in the university. And he asks the question, has political correctness stifled academic freedom? There's a good example on page 226 that I'm not going to read from you, but you need to take a look at that. Is it politically incorrect for people to study racial differences in intelligence? Does that mean you are necessarily a prejudiced individual, or is it legitimate to take a look at those kinds of things and see what comes out in the study? So be sure you read that section as well in Shalom. And then Shalom examines the question, are professors more liberal than the population at large? Because there's always this notion that you have these liberal professors that are trying to indoctrinate students into a liberalist agenda. So take a look at what he says about that as well. We tend to have more liberal professors who are more liberal in certain areas of college studies, and then professors who are less liberal and more conservative in other areas of college teaching. So, in summary, ideology is a sum total of our life experience. Our beliefs are formed in this particular way, and then we begin to think of ourselves as whether we're conservative or liberal in our outlook and attitudes towards government. This is basically what these belief systems are. We tend to look at life in terms of the liberal thought, perhaps, that we should redistribute government resources to provide more social services for folks, or as a conservative, where we should keep the government out of the economy And maybe we should, if you're conservative, try to regulate social morality in a lot of ways, which conservatives do tend to do. They like more government involvement in social issues, and they like less government involvement in economic issues. Liberals tend to prefer more government involvement in economic issues and less government involvement in social issues. So ideology is very important, and how we develop our ideologies is important. We're going to talk about this week on the discussion board, so keep all this in mind. So to summarize this particular piece of the micro lectures for this week, often we take a look at public ideology. How do individual public opinions turn into aggregate public opinion? And we're going to take a look at this. How well do citizens understand issues and candidates, particularly in America? And then what affects citizen understanding of issues and candidates? So we're going to turn our attention to that, and to do that we want to answer the first bullet point. How well do citizens understand political events and political issues? Well, we want to take a look next at polling. Polling techniques. What makes a poll valid? When is a poll something that really reflects genuine public opinion? So let's take a look at that. And then later we'll turn our attention to what affects citizen understanding of issues and candidates. And during that section we're going to look at the role and nature of the media and how the media shapes our public opinion and in turn helps shape public policy. So that's where we're headed. So this concludes this micro lecture. Go to the next one on public polling and public opinion, and we'll take a look at those things.